What if the poorest army in West Africa suddenly became the most prepared? What if the smallest voice on the continent rose not in protest, but in power? That question stopped being theory on the 10th day of October, 2025. It found an address, Ouagadougou. It found a face, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. For years, Burkina Faso was spoken about, never to. The world called it fragile, poor, a place for pity and policy. But that morning, when engines rumbled through the capital and sunlight glinted off rows of armored steel, something ancient stirred, the spirit of a people who had waited too long for permission. Every roar, every tank, every soldier's step said one thing: we are done asking, we are ready to build. Because sometimes silence is not surrender, it's preparation. And when preparation finally speaks, even the mighty fall quiet. If you believe Africa's story deserves to be told by Africans themselves, subscribe, stay, and walk with us through the week when a forgotten nation rose and said, "We will never bow again." The 10th of October dawned like any other dry season morning, bright, still, unassuming. But by noon, history had taken the wheel. From the heart of Ouagadougou, convoys of newly restored armored vehicles rolled out beneath the rising dust. Not borrowed, not imported. Rebuilt by Burkinabe hands. Rows upon rows of steel stood gleaming under the sun. Over 300 vehicles, dozens of artillery units, anti-aircraft guns, and troop carriers, each carrying the same inscription: Made in Burkina. And behind the machinery stood something greater: faith. President Ibrahim Traoré stood before the crowd, the wind lifting the flag behind him. He spoke not as a politician, but as a son of the soil. We will defend our nation with our own means, our own engineers, our own determination. For a moment, the city held its breath. People listened, not to promises, but to proof. State television broadcast the event live, images spreading like wildfire across the Sahel. From Bamako to Accra, from Dakar to Lagos, the question echoed: where did this power come from? The world's analysts scoured satellite feeds, diplomats whispered in corridors, journalists typed faster than ever. But the answer did not come. Burkina Faso did not explain. It only acted. And in that silence, the nation grew louder. For decades, we were told independence meant flags and anthems. But here, in the dust of Ouagadougou, we saw something deeper: independence with tools, with hands, with courage. The young engineers who worked night and day inside dim workshops now watched their creations march down the same roads they once swept. Fathers saluted sons. Mechanics stood like generals. The air was heavy, but not with fear, with meaning. Inside homes, elders wept quietly. They remembered another time, when French soldiers drove these same machines under a foreign flag. Now they rolled again, reborn, carrying only the red, green, and gold of Burkina Faso. This was not a parade of aggression. It was resurrection. But as the cheers rose, so did the whispers. Where did the parts come from? Who paid for it? Was Russia behind it? Was China involved? The questions multiplied. By evening, the headlines burned across the globe. Burkina Faso unveils mysterious new arsenal. West African nation rearming beyond expectation. But within the nation, the message was simple: we are done waiting for permission. And as the night settled over Ouagadougou, the streets fell silent. But it was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of focus. Because the people knew, deep in their bones, that this was only the beginning. The world had questions, but Burkina Faso had none to answer. Its silence had become its loudest weapon. The roar of engines had barely faded when the whispers began. Across the Sahel, the air itself seemed to carry a question. Where did they get it? Paris called it concerning. Washington called it unusual. But in Ouagadougou, the people called it freedom. Within 24 hours, headlines spread faster than dust storms. France convened urgent meetings. Analysts spoke of non-traditional suppliers. Journalists leaned on unnamed sources. Words like Moscow, Wagner, and destabilization floated through the air like smoke. But the truth was quieter and far more powerful. What terrified them was not the machinery, it was the message. Because when a poor nation learns to build, the rich can no longer sell dependence. At the French Foreign Office, a spokesperson stepped before the cameras, her face composed but her voice tight. "We are seeking clarification from Ouagadougou regarding the origin of these systems," she said. Behind her, the tricolor flag barely stirred. The weight of colonial memory hung heavier than wind. In Washington, the tone was cautious, calculated. The State Department spoke of regional stability and the need for transparency. But beneath the language of diplomacy was something older, the unease of losing control. For over a century, Africa's power had been managed, monitored, and measured by others. But this was unmeasured, unexpected, unapproved. And in the corridors of ECOWAS, the story turned into a storm. Some leaders argued for diplomacy, others for pressure. Nigeria and Ghana whispered of verification missions. Senegal and Côte d'Ivoire murmured about sanctions. But no one could agree on one thing. What if Burkina Faso had truly done this alone? Because if one nation could rebuild its strength from the rust of empire, what stopped others from doing the same? That question scared them more than any weapon. In living rooms across Africa, people watched the broadcasts with mixed hearts. Some worried, others whispered prayers, but most simply smiled, because they recognized what the world could not. That power, once reclaimed, can never again be borrowed. We saw, in those days, not just a political moment, but a spiritual one. It was as if every generation that had fought for independence, every ancestor that had toiled under chains, was whispering through the dust, "Stand, my children, stand." Meanwhile, the Western press framed Traoré as a strongman, a populist, a nationalist. But the streets of Ouagadougou called him something else, a servant. Old women selling fruit raised their hands to the sky, blessing his name. Young men in uniform saluted the idea, not the man, and everywhere the same sentence echoed, "We forge what we need." Still, outside those borders, unease turned into strategy. Development aid was paused, meetings were postponed, European envoys debated quietly whether a line had been crossed. Was this sovereignty or rebellion? In the calm offices of think tanks, experts spoke of repercussions. But in the open markets of Ouagadougou, mothers spoke of restoration. Because only those who have been denied dignity understand the price of reclaiming it. One Western diplomat, off record, told Le Monde, "We no longer have eyes or leverage there. The information vacuum is total, and that is dangerous." But to the people of Burkina Faso, that vacuum was not danger. It was space. Finally, the space to breathe without foreign hands around their decisions. And so the silence continued. No press releases, no explanations, just soldiers training, engineers repairing, farmers returning to their fields, life moving forward without permission. And yet, in the background, the pressure mounted. ECOWAS announced an emergency session in Abuja. France summoned its ambassadors for consultation. Washington called for alignment with established frameworks. The language was diplomatic, but the emotion behind it was fear. Fear that Africa had begun to believe in itself again. Across the Sahel, whispers turned to conversations, conversations into conviction, conviction into courage. From Mali to Niger, from Ghana to Chad, One question became a prayer. If they can rebuild, why not us? And that was when the world understood. This was not about weapons. This was about a continent remembering its worth. By the third night, embassies stayed lit till dawn. Analysts scrolled through blurred footage, and generals called for calm. But the man at the center of it all, the Burkina Faso president, said nothing. He simply waited. And in that waiting, power began to shift. By the fourth day, the applause had faded, replaced by questions, tension, and something deeper than fear: resolve. Across Ouagadougou, the energy shifted. Markets still opened, children still laughed, but a quiet undercurrent ran through the city. People sensed that the winds had changed, not from outside, but from within. Then came the first ripple. Foreign aid payments were delayed. European banks reassessed risk exposure. Development agencies paused infrastructure disbursements. The language was polite, but the message was clear: obey or endure. For decades, such pressure had bent smaller nations to their knees. But this time, Burkina Faso did not bend. The radio carried the words of a government spokesman. We are aware of the pressures, but we will not trade independence for convenience. Fuel prices crept up. Lines stretched at petrol stations. Cargo trucks slowed along the Abidjan corridor as insurers reviewed coverage. Whispers of economic isolation filled the cafes and courtyards. Yet instead of unrest, there was resolve. On street corners, citizens said it plainly: this is the cost of sovereignty. The phrase spread from market stalls to university halls, from radios to pulpits. It became more than a slogan, it was a hymn, and the people sang it softly: the cost of sovereignty. Because somewhere deep in the African heart, we know freedom is never free. In the palaces of Paris, diplomats fretted. In the offices of Washington, briefings grew tense. In Abuja, ECOWAS leaders debated their next move, torn between alliance and respect. Some urged restraint, others demanded verification. But the truth was simple. Burkina Faso's silence frightened them more than any speech could. It was a silence that spoke of conviction, not confusion. A silence that refused to beg for legitimacy. A silence that said, "We will endure." Inside the capital, the mood was not despair. It was discipline. The military worked around the clock, refitting equipment, retraining recruits, strengthening logistics. Young engineers, once unemployed, now wore uniforms stained with oil and pride. Local news anchors repeated the president's words from days before: "We will rely on our own means." And in that phrase, people found comfort, not because life was easy, but because meaning had returned. For too long, Africa's headlines had been written by outsiders. But this week, every Burkinabe citizen became an author of their own story. Even as the cost of living rose, even as Western commentators warned of instability, the streets remained calm. There was something sacred in the air, not rage, not denial, but discipline born of dignity. A shopkeeper told a reporter, "We waited for others to save us, but no one came. Now we save ourselves." The night before the president's expected address, the entire nation seemed to hold its breath. Television sets stayed on late into the night, flickering blue light through shuttered windows. In markets, radios crackled with rumors. In churches and mosques, people prayed for wisdom, not for the world to understand them, but for their leader to speak with truth. Even the air felt heavy, as if the ancestors themselves leaned closer, listening. A veteran soldier was heard saying, "He won't beg, he'll explain." And that was the feeling across the land, not fear, but faith. Faith that the silence had purpose. Faith that the waiting meant something. Outside, soldiers took up quiet positions at intersections. The city was not under lockdown. It was under expectation. Across West Africa, embassies stayed awake. Phones rang through the night. Ministers drafted responses, uncertain of what dawn might bring. Would Traoré compromise? Would he confront? Would he speak at all? By midnight, the state broadcaster interrupted its usual programming. A single line of white text appeared against a red background. The president of the transition will address the nation at 09 Traoré local time. No anthem. No commentary. Just silence. And in that silence, hope and tension braided together. Across the Sahel, millions tuned in. Soldiers in Mali, farmers in Niger, students in Senegal, each wondering if this young leader would bow or blaze. As night covered Ouagadougou, no one slept. They were waiting, not for words, but for revelation, because when a nation holds its breath, even the world must listen. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, the screen flickered, and there he was. No anthem, no fanfare, no flags behind him, just a wooden lectern, a single folder, and a man who had chosen silence long enough. Captain Ibrahim Traoré looked straight into the camera, his eyes steady, his voice unhurried. "For 1 week," he began, "the world has spoken about our weapons. Today we speak about their truth." The nation leaned forward. The world leaned in. His speech lasted less than 12 minutes, but its echo will outlive generations. He spoke of the AES framework, a regional initiative uniting engineers and technicians from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. He spoke of warehouses filled with abandoned machines, relics left by colonial armies decades ago. And then he lifted a folder, its pages marked and aged. There is no Russian shipment, no Chinese supplier. These are French-era systems, rebuilt by our own people. We did not buy power. We reclaimed what was left to rust. Those words traveled faster than light. Within minutes, African broadcasters interrupted programming to replay the speech. Across Ouagadougou, spontaneous cheers erupted. Men wept. Women ululated. And in workshops across the city, engineers stood taller, hands trembling with pride. In Paris, silence. In Washington, confusion. In Abuja, disbelief. Reporters scrambled for evidence, and found it. Serial numbers matched French inventories withdrawn years ago. Suddenly, the narrative shifted. No longer Burkina's secret weapons. Now, Burkina Faso rebuilds colonial relics into tools of independence. The speech turned accusation into admiration, criticism into confirmation, and suspicion into sovereignty. Across the Sahel, leaders from Mali and Niger praised the revelation. Malian interim president Assimi Goïta posted, "History does not repeat itself. This time, Africa repairs itself." Even Western diplomats, off record, admitted he used truth as a weapon and caught us unprepared. But Traoré did not smile nor boast. He simply ended his address with quiet authority. When freedom puts on armor, no empire has the courage to preach peace. And then he stepped away. No slogans, no applause, just silence, the kind that carries weight, not emptiness. That day, across the Sahel, people said one phrase over and over again: "We forge what we need." It was no longer a slogan. It was scripture. The revelation had shattered doubt. But a new question arose. Could this newfound independence survive the storm it had summoned? The dust had settled. The shouting had faded. And in the quiet streets of Ouagadougou, life resumed, not as before, but renewed. There were no fireworks, no parades, no grand speeches. Only the steady rhythm of a nation returning to work, its heartbeat stronger, its gaze clearer. For the first time in living memory, the people of Burkina Faso were not waiting. Not for loans, not for approval, not for applause. They had stood before the world and said, "We can." And they had proven it. The revelation had traveled far beyond the borders of the Sahel. In Ghana, students debated it in classrooms. In Nigeria, commentators called it a blueprint for dignity. In Senegal, elders whispered, The children are finally waking up. Because this was more than a political act, it was a spiritual one. A reclamation not only of weapons, but of will. Across Africa, millions watched and realized that independence was never about the date on a flag. It was about the decision in the heart. For years, we were told that strength must come from outside. But Traoré's message was simple. Strength begins when a nation believes it already has enough. That belief, that quiet, grounded faith, began to move mountains. Aid agencies hesitated. Foreign ministries recalculated. Even critics began to soften. Because what can you say to a people who build their own tools, write their own truth, and stand by their own word? And as the days passed, something beautiful began to happen. The world stopped talking about Burkina Faso and started listening to it. From church pulpits in Atlanta to radio stations in Nairobi, from old veterans in Lagos to youth movements in Harlem, one line was repeated again and again. When freedom puts on armor, the world must reckon with its silence. The story had outgrown its borders. It had become a mirror, showing every African, every believer in justice, what it means to endure, to rebuild, to stand. This was no longer just about a president or an army. It was about the rebirth of faith in self-determination. And so, as the sun rose over Ouagadougou on the 15th of October, there was no music, no marching band. Only the clear wind moving, across a flag that needed no permission to fly. It whispered the same words the people now lived by. We did not wait for permission. That sentence, simple, strong, sacred, will echo through the years to come. Because what Burkina Faso proved in that week was this, that the poorest can be the proudest, that silence can speak louder than propaganda, and that sometimes the smallest nations teach the world the largest truths. And so we ask, not as watchers, but as witnesses. What happens when the rest of Africa decides to do the same? And so, as the sun lifted its light over Ouagadougou, a new rhythm began. Not of drums or marching boots, but of a people walking tall again. The week that began with questions ended with clarity. Burkina Faso had shown that freedom is not something to be borrowed. It is something to be rebuilt. This was more than a headline in Burkina Faso news. It was a revelation written not in ink, but in effort. A declaration not shouted from podiums, but forged in workshops, in classrooms, in hearts. For generations, the continent was told, you are too poor, too weak, too late. But this week, Africa answered, we are enough. The Burkina Faso president did not just give a speech, he gave a generation its reflection. He reminded us that sovereignty is not a slogan, it is sacrifice. That leadership is not dominance, it is devotion. And that real power is not about ruling others, but rebuilding yourself. Across the Sahel, the echoes remain. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, from Harlem to Lagos, people whisper those same words. We forge what we need. And as the story of Burkina Faso continues to unfold, the world will keep watching, searching for updates in Burkina Faso news, trying to understand what happened, when perhaps the truth is simple. Nothing happened. Something awakened. It was not a rebellion. It was remembrance of who we were and who we could still become. So tonight, if you believe in the dignity of self-reliance, if you believe that the smallest nation can carry the largest light, then share this story, not as news, but as faith. Because independence is not a moment. It is a motion, and that motion begins every time one of us decides to stand. If you still believe Africa's destiny belongs to Africans, subscribe, stay, and let the world know. We will not wait for permission anymore. God bless Burkina Faso. God bless Africa.